Good evening and welcome to the KTWU studios on the campus of Washburn University. I'm Val Vandersloot, General Manager for KTWU.
And I'm Jacqueline Lightcap with the League of Women Voters of Kansas.
KTWU and the League of Women Voters are proud to bring this evening's debate forum to you. As the public television station in Northeast Kansas, it is important for us to provide you with knowledge and insight as you exercise your rights as an informed voter.
The League of Women Voters of Kansas has an over 100-year tradition as a nonpartisan, grassroots, volunteer-led organization that encourages informed and active participation at all levels of government. We strive to increase understanding of major public policy issues through voter education events like candidate forums and debates, just like tonight's event.
Now, please stay tuned as we bring you the candidates vying for a seat in the race for Kansas Secretary of State.
KTWU Public Television and the League of Women Voters of Kansas present a political forum featuring candidates for the office of Kansas Secretary of State. Here is your moderator, Bob Beatty.
Secretary of State. It is one of the most important jobs in Kansas, the person in charge of our elections. Hello, I'm Bob Beatty. And this hour, we bring you Republican Scott Schwab and Democrat JeAnna Repass in the Kansas Secretary of State candidate debate. In the next 60 minutes, we give you a chance to see both candidates up close as they answer questions from you on Facebook and Twitter, from our studio audience, and from our debate partners, the League of Women Voters. But let me introduce you to the candidates. Scott Schwab is the current Secretary of State, and before that served in the Kansas legislature. He lives in Overland Park. JeAnna Repass also hails from Overland Park and is a businesswoman, has worked for several nonprofit organizations, and is active in the field of education. This debate is a partnership with the League of Women Voters, and they have selected the topics. We'll also be taking questions from our studio audience and from you on Facebook and Twitter. So let's hear from the candidates themselves. Why do you want to be Secretary of State? And what uniquely qualifies you for this job? We've given each of the candidates 120 seconds to answer that question, starting with you, JeAnna Repass.
Well, thank you, Bob. Well, I'd like to start off by thanking Professor Beatty, the League of Women Voters of Kansas, Washburn University, KTWU, Val Vandersloot, and all media outlets and groups who've sponsored and broadcast candidate debates and forums this year. Nothing is more important in a democracy than a well-informed electorate. My name is JeAnna Repass, and I want to earn your vote to be the next Secretary of State for the great state of Kansas. I'm a wife and a mother of 3 amazing children, all who graduated from Blue Valley Northwest High School in Overland Park, Kansas. Go Huskies. My career path has been multifaceted. I have experience as a corporate media executive and in not-for-profit community outreach and engagement in the private sector. And I work for the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection in Leawood. I've been held accountable in both the boardroom and to the public. I'm running for the Secretary of State because I believe we can make this office more efficient, more effective, and more transparent. We live in times where voting, the very foundation of our great democracy, is being questioned and attacked. As your Chief Elections Officer, I will work every day to address the concerns of all voters across Kansas. I will work to build confidence in our electoral process, making it more transparent, and instill in all voters that they should have the knowledge that their vote is safe, secure, and counted. I'd like to pause for a moment and wish a very happy birthday, a 96th birthday to my grandma Doris Manley Orduna. She is watching the live stream in Omaha, Nebraska. She was born on November 1st, 1926. So happy birthday, Grandma. I look forward to answering your questions tonight and to earning your vote on November 8th. Thank you.
Now we go to Scott Schwab.
Thank you, and I will wish Grandma a happy birthday as well. That's quite the accomplishment. That being said, my name is Scott Schwab. I am the Secretary of State for the state of Kansas. I too want to thank KWU, the university, and also the league. And I grew up in Great Bend, Kansas, graduated from Fort Hays State University, and then worked for Kansas Farm Bureau before, after putting my wife through pharmacy school at the University of Kansas, got involved in politics and making policy for several years in the state of Kansas. When we campaigned 4 years ago, we campaigned with the slogan and the promise that we want trusted results. And whether it's on the business side or whether it's on the election side, we've proven it time and time and time again with bipartisan compliments and praise, whether it's from the press, through various editorials, through the governor herself, the attorney general who's running against her, and even the legislature is constantly complimented us on the way we've run our office. We've updated our website to make it easier for business filings, for those who are filing their LLCs and corporations and doing mergers and acquisitions in our office. And we've also passed a law recently that says hopefully soon next year you'll be able to do your business filing not once a year but every other year, because we want to alleviate that administrative burden on businesses as we grow business in this state. On the election side, we've shown through over 300 post-election audits that our elections are secure and can be trusted. We've been accused over years of having fraud. We've been accused of voter suppression, and not once has there been proof that any of those exist in the state of Kansas. While the national conversation sometimes attacks the election systems, Kansas proves we get it right. We had record voter turnout in 2020, even higher turnout than any other primary in history this last August. And it just goes to show that it's easy to vote in Kansas and it's hard to cheat the system. Thank you. And again, I am Scott Schwab.
All right, let's get right to the questions. You mentioned the word trust. Given the nature of this position, we could argue that trust is a very important aspect of this job. So both candidates, please share with us a specific example or experience that's illustrative of your personal integrity and your commitment to fairness and honesty. And we start with Scott Schwab.
After almost 20 years in the state legislature, I was known as the rules guy. It goes back to a short story that the clerk then, when we were going through orientation, said, here's the rule book. You all want to claim to read it, but you'll get so bored with it, you'll never read it. Go ask your state legislator that I was the one not only read it, I annotated it, and was on the Rules Committee and was vehemently defender of the rules in the State House. Because if we couldn't maintain order, it doesn't matter the quality of the policy you have, because people will think it came through hijinks or through cheating. We've carried that into this office. We obey the rules, whether it's the Help America Vote Act, whether it's the National Voter Registration Act, or the laws that have been passed in Topeka. We have maintained that. And when we've seen a law coming through the legislature, even from my own party, that I thought would compromise voter integrity or people's ability to vote, we stood up and said, that's a bad law, it hurts Kansans. And we've been able to defend our system because we take that mentality of we are rule followers, and then we execute it through this administrative branch of saying, and we make sure all our clerks and poll workers are rule followers. And we do really good work at it.
JeAnna Repass.
Well, thank you. I'm going to give you a little bit of a different example about trust. When I was doing not-for-profit work with United Methodist Church of the Resurrection, one of the things we were doing was trying to do urban development. And there were a lot of blighted houses that went into land grants. And we wanted to buy those homes and give them back to the people in the neighborhoods. We worked with several on-the-ground community organizations. One was an organization called Gentlemen of the Round Table. And they worked with formerly incarcerated men, got them suits and ties and helped them get jobs. We felt like home ownership would be a key for them to get out of the malaise of constant recycling. We went down to the city clerk's office down in Kansas City, Missouri, with $100,000 in cash because you had to purchase those homes in cash. And I was the one that was trusted. I was the director, but I was the one they trusted to walk around with $100,000 in cash. They knew that I said what I meant and meant what I said. It's very hard to define how you trust someone unless you hand them a whole bunch of cash without any trail on that. So we were able to do that. We were able to help people rebuild their lives. And as far as trustworthiness, my word is my bond. If I say something, I do it. I believe in people, but I believe that people believe in you when your integrity shows through, when you've proven by what your actions are. It's not just what you promise, but what you deliver.
Thank you. Next question. A former Kansas Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, set up a political action committee when he was in office. According to the Hutchinson News, Kobach's Prairie Fire PAC spent money on advertising to help elect or defeat various state legislative candidates. So the question is, this incident, I would argue, begs the question. The Secretary of State is in charge of all candidates in all elections and overseeing them. Should he or she be partisan? We start with JeAnna Repass.
This should be an absolutely nonpartisan role. Obviously, I'm representing the Democratic Party. Mr. Schwab is a Republican. We have a Libertarian in the race, and we have a great number of unaffiliateds in this state. But the role of the chief elections officer should be completely nonpartisan, completely integrous, dedicated only to making sure that every voter in Kansas has an opportunity to cast their ballot and that ballot counts. There should be zero partisanship in this. I'm actually a little sorry that we run this as partisan, and we have to do a party affiliation to be your chief elections officer, but that is the law. Those are the rules established by Kansas. But at the end of the day, I will not support any Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, or unaffiliated outside of the law, outside of the rules. And my job will be to make sure that we reinstill that trust. And if we are nonpartisan, not bipartisan, that has a different connotation. If we are nonpartisan, then we can do that for the people of Kansas.
Scott Schwab.
You know, I disagreed with the PAC, and I was vocal so when I was in the legislature. And in our administration, I have not endorsed candidates that we oversee or we certify their election, because I don't think it's appropriate to be the referee and then also make it look like you're trying to put your hand on the scale. Now, I do want to be clear. There's a difference between being partisan and partisanship. They are two different things. I do think it's important to say, hey, I'm a Republican, because there's a worldview that defines that. And people have a general idea of where you're coming from. And then there's Democrat partisans that they have a worldview coming from a Democrat stance, and same with Libertarian. That's not bad. Those aren't necessarily identifying labels. It just gives the voter an idea of where you're coming from. And you can run as an independent in Kansas. We see that right now in the governor's race. However, partisanship coming into the Secretaries of State race can become toxic. And forming a PAC, although it was legal, there are things that are legal that are not appropriate. Maintaining not only integrity in the office, but the perception of integrity in the office is very important. We've strived to do that. We've accomplished it simply by not weighing into these races. And sometimes it's difficult because you're asking for someone to endorse you and say, oh, by the way, I can't endorse you, because there's a code amongst our secretaries of state, both Democrat and Republican across the nation, that you don't endorse in these races simply because you're the referee. Don't put your hand on the scale.
Thank you. I like this next question. It's straightforward. Both of you mentioned it a bit in your opening, and we start with Scott Schwab. Do you feel Kansas has a safe and fair voting system? Please elaborate.
Absolutely. And we've defended it from, we've been attacked by the extremes on the right, saying that there was voter fraud after the primary. We've more than proven, if we haven't proven it before, we've proven it by now that that's not the case. And then we've been attacked on the right, saying that there's voter suppression, and we've never again had a case where we suppress individuals' votes. At the end of the day, it's easy to vote in Kansas and it's hard to cheat. It is more difficult to start a new iPhone up than it is to register to vote. As a matter of fact, I was really proud in 2020, which was a struggling time for Secretary of State, county clerks, and poll workers to do the election in the middle of a pandemic. We're having to do a lot of recruiting for new poll workers because some of our elderly poll workers were concerned about being poll workers. We were able to do it. And we certified an election that Governor Kelly, myself, and Derek Schmidt all signed and said, yes, we believe these results are correct. You can get the three of us to agree on anything. It's probably pretty accurate. Did the same thing in the primary. And I will defend our elections to my blood. When I put my signature on it, I put my signature on my work, and our poll workers and our county clerks burn the midnight oil to make sure they do, in fact, get the right answer. May not be the quick answer, but the right answer is more important than the quick answer.
Thank you. JeAnna?
Well, yes, and I would say yes. I do believe they're secure, but I can tell you there's always room for improvement. We saw a recent poll where 22% of Kansans believe that there's some measure of irregularity, either fraud or voting insecurity. That is 1 in 5 Kansans. So with all due respect to Mr. Schwab saying, yep, this is right, we've got it right. If 1 in 5 of our neighbors don't think that, there's room for improvement here. I happen to believe that the 2020 elections were safe and free of fraud. I believe, as Mr. Schwab said, that we've got processes in place, but I can tell you that if you look at those processes, there were several protocols where we missed some steps. I don't believe it changed the outcome of a single election, and that's why the elections were certified, and that's why we stand by those. But the fact of the matter is, until we get more of our electorate to believe that our elections are free and safe and fair, we've got a problem. It is not enough to simply tell people, hey, it's safe, sit down, don't ask, don't worry. We have to address that head on, and until all of us believe that we have safe and secure elections, we have a very big issue that we have to address. As your Secretary of State, I will take that on head on immediately.
Let's talk ballot drop boxes. Are you for them? Why or why not? And what's your take on people in some states videotaping voters and their license plates of their cars when they simply go to drop a ballot off in a drop box? We start with JeAnna Repass.
Well, I will tell you that every time you drop something in the mail, you are dropping it in a drop box. So we've had drop boxes for a long time. I will tell you, I believe that they are safe. But again, I go back to the fact that I know, because I've talked to Kansans, I haven't dismissed a single voice. I've sat at table with people from all ilks, and they've been very clear that they have concerns about the drop boxes. I'm gonna probably bury the lead here for Mr. Schwab. I've heard him talk about if he's going to give you $1,000, would you rather have him put it in the mail or drop it off on your front porch? Well, on my front porch, we have security cameras, really good ones, ones that can read your license plate down the street. But what I'm saying to you is there's always room to improve what we're doing. And as long as people have questions, it's our job to be seeking those answers so that they feel like their vote is secure. I can tell you we have processes in place. I'm proud of those processes. I believe Kansans their votes are safe, even in drop boxes. But unless and until we have more people who believe that, we have got to be listening to them, and there's always room for improvement. There's always things we can do to make those secure. And to the second part of the question, people videotaping and standing there, listen, they have a First Amendment right to gather. I would rather not have people making other people uncomfortable when they're voting. We don't have that going on in Kansas. But I would discourage people from doing that. Voting is the number one most important thing we can do in our democracy. So I really wish people wouldn't do that.
Scott Schwab?
I'm always honored when your opponent quotes you in a positive way. Doesn't always happen, but thank you. I agree. I trust the drop boxes more than the post office. We have clerks that we've talked to that have found ballots show up at the clerk's office a year after the election has happened. And it's sad. In Seward County, down by Liberal, the post office is across the street from the county office. You put it in the post office drop box, it goes to Santa Fe, New Mexico to hopefully show up across the street. Or you can put it in the drop box at the county office. There's 2 locks where it's handled by 2 Kansans that are sworn to Kansas law of 2 different parties to make sure those ballots are handled within the Kansas chain of custody. And they're not handled like your Bed Bath & Beyond coupon that may or may not come in whole. So I've always been an advocate for drop boxes simply because don't give your ballot to the federal government. The people that question them are listening to outside of Kansas voices, and the national conversation comes into Kansas. No elected official in Kansas can control that except for we continue to say the message which we have. But to say we can do better, man, I don't know. If you've gone and visited with our county clerks and what they do, the agility and the freedom of which we have, Kansas has all our elections funded on the local level and executed on the local level. It is your neighbors that are handling your election. That is fantastic. And can we always improve? As in technology improves, yes. We look at election security as cybersecurity. Always be aware. But I'm not here to criticize simply because somebody saw a YouTube video that criticized somebody.
So this is a follow-up. Each of you will have a minute, and it's linked to this idea of maybe bullying or voter intimidation at these drop boxes, but it's more about election workers and possible intimidation of poll workers or election officials. What about election worker harassment? Does Kansas need specific laws regarding threatening an election official? I know some states have looked into that. Others say they don't need them. So each have a minute. We'll start with JeAnna Repass to weigh in on that subject.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to circle back. I heard Mr. Schwab say everything's fair and everything's fine, and don't treat your ballot like your Bed Bath & Beyond. That's a real kitschy, nice phrase, but the fact of the matter is people are concerned. We are not dismissing them. They know that the poll workers are their neighbors, but they're still elevating concerns, and it's not okay to dismiss those because we are disenfranchising voters. There are people who don't believe in our process, whether they saw a YouTube video or whether they read something online. It is our responsibility to reinstill that in them, and dismissing them, being flippant about it, that is not going to get us to where we need to go. Now, to answer your question, Bob, absolutely. Our poll workers are the essential lifeblood of our democracy. We can't vote if we don't have those key volunteers in place, and we should be protecting them, and no one should be harassing anybody who has volunteered their time in the most important thing we do in our democracy.
Scott Schwab?
Yeah, we get security briefings from local law enforcement, national law enforcement, and from CISA, and we're always aware of what is the safety and what is the atmosphere as it relates to poll workers. And I don't like the concept of people videoing people dropping off their ballot, because I do look at that as a form of voter intimidation. And whether you go back to Dallas County, Alabama, there's just no place for that anymore in today's history. I will say this. There's a difference between passionate and flippant. And I'm passionate about our local poll workers, and I care very deeply about their safety. And you got to walk a fine line between, you don't want police circling polling places. We've been there, and it's a horrible circumstance, but at the same time, you want to make sure there's safety. And KBI's worked very well with that. But I wouldn't say I've said anything flippant, and the quote she attributed to me is not what I said. When somebody's lying about your election system, you have a job to tell the truth. And we've done it for 4 years. Have we listened? Absolutely. But we've also refuted it. I'm not going to make them feel good by saying, I believe your lie. I'm telling the truth.
We're going to circle back to something both of you already talked about. They're called election deniers. They're people who deny the results of the 2020 election in America. And they include some pretty well-known people. By one estimate, they include over 300 candidates who are running for office in America today. And again, I know you've mentioned this, but I have to ask, are either of you one of those 300? If so, explain why. If not, what do you say to the people, that seem to be many of them, who say, oh, the 2020 election was fraudulent? And we start with Scott Schwab.
Well, you know, if Trump thought there was fraud in Kansas, he could have called our office and contested the results, and we could have done a statewide hand count. It would have been about $250,000. That phone call never came. We've had some legislators who thought there was fraud that are elected, and I told them, if you believe you're elected out of fraud, you can contest your election and do a hand count and see if there's any anomalies. As a result of the value of them both amendment, an individual out of Wichita was manipulated to put $118,000 on his personal credit card. We ended up recounting 61% of the ballots cast in the largest primary the state has ever had. And the result was proof. We got it right. Our county clerks showed that the winners were in fact winners, the losers were in fact losers. The amendment was recounted, a state house race out in western Kansas was recounted, and several counties in the treasurer's race was also recounted. Nothing changed. At the end of the day, when you've proven it, you don't just listen to the lie again. I mean, the press asked me, you know, they said, clearly you've proven that Kansas has safe and secure elections. What do you say to the handful of people that still disagree? There's a handful of people who still think the world's flat, too. You have to move on to the people who want the truth, and not the people who, when you solve their one lie, look for the next lie, because they care more about believing the lie than learning the truth. And it's not 20%. After that recount, it has drastically shrunk.
JeAnna Repass.
Well, the short answer is no. I am not one of those candidates who's running on an election denial system. I believe that in the United States of America, we have free and fair elections. I believe that the 2020 election. Now, I will tell you, Mr. Schwab is talking about the fact that Donald Trump could have called him. Donald Trump won the state by 15 points. There was no reason for him to call. I think the question is what happens when you have a really close call. And what we saw was that there was a recount that was put on a credit card, and had that credit card company defaulted on that payment, that would have fallen to the people of Johnson County, where both Mr. Schwab and I live. But we're going to move on from that. I just have to push back on the fact that, you know, to say that we just have a handful of people, I'm going to harken back to our August 2nd primary. Mr. Schwab had a primary, and there was another person on the ballot. He didn't make it through that primary, but almost 200,000 Kansans voted. And I've spoken to not all 200,000, I'll be honest, but several of them. And what they have said is they have questions. And by listening to questions, it's not as though you're agreeing. We're not going to agree on everything. I've already said that. Where we have disagreement, we can have dialogue. And if you're listening, you can find the places where you do agree. And quite frankly, dismissing people is never going to get them to the place where you want them to go. And where we want them to go is that every Kansan, whether it's 1 out of 5, whether it's 20%, whether it's a handful who's making a lot of noise, it's our responsibility, because we work for the people of Kansas, not to dismiss them, but to hear them and see where we can find agreement.
Thank you. This is a follow-up question, so a minute each, and I have a fear this might be a little existential or philosophical, but give it a shot. It's a follow-up question. Both of you are not election deniers. Why is this happening in the United States after 239 years of American elections to such a degree that it is happening now? We start with JeAnna Repass.
Well, we have the internet. And misinformation travels a lot quicker than truth. And that's unfortunate. And somebody can put something up on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, and it goes out. You can pull it down, but it lives in infamy. And that's been part of the problem. And I will tell you, I'm going to give you a quick example. Anything that's done in the dark gives people doubt. And I'm not saying that we're doing our elections in the dark, but once someone puts something up and says, hey, here's a misstep here, or here's something I didn't see, or there hasn't been full transparency, if people can't see it, they don't necessarily understand it. So they turn to sources like the internet to give them information. And I'll tell you, Bob, I believe that's why it has spread so far. 200 years ago, we did not have the internet. We had the Great Pony Express up in St. Joe, Missouri. It took a long time to get disinformation out. And people trusted their neighbors. We had truth that we could trust. And that's really been part of the problem, is that truth is a little bit harder to get out than fiction, especially when fiction's put out on the internet.
Scott Schwab.
Well, I haven't ever dismissed people's concerns. I mean, I've spent over 20 years in addressing Kansas concerns and never dismissed them. But I always have rebutted misinformation in saying that I just dismiss this is outside the realm. But I will say social media has played a large part of it, because people more and more are going to their echo chambers. If you lean Republican, you trust Fox News, you don't CNN. If you're more Democrat, you trust CNN, you don't Fox News. I'm a Wall Street Journal guy. It seems like I kind of get both of them through there. But we have a situation where the louder the rhetoric, the more people listen to you. The more extreme the rhetoric, the more people listen to you. And we've seen this. There's cycles in politics, often like there are in stock markets. And we saw loud rhetoric in the 60s and in the 70s, and so they just wanted a calm president. So Jimmy Carter comes in, you have inflation, Middle East uprising, you have Russia getting stronger, and what came next was a Reagan who had a very positive message, and I think that's what we're on the horizon for.
All right, thank you. What policies do you support to improve accessibility for voting in Kansas? This might include early voting, the number of polling locations. It's whatever you want to talk about in terms of accessibility. And JeAnna Repass, we start with you.
Well, thank you. One of the things that I believe that we ought to be putting some weight behind, there are 19 states in our great American Union that have statewide holidays on Election Day. And since electing our officials is the lifeblood of our democracy, the most important thing we can do, I would love that to be a holiday, to be a celebratory day, much like the 4th of July. In my family, we always vote in person. We vote on voting day, and I'll tell you why. There were a lot of people in the history of our country who look like me. I was talking to Pastor C.L. Backus out of Kansas City, Kansas. He was raised in Mississippi, and he told me that both of his parents died without ever being able to cast a vote. So I've always felt like it's important to go and vote in person. I've taken my children with me until they were all of age to vote, and now they all do. So I think it's very important to go into the voting booth on voting day and do that. But I will tell you, I think an election day holiday would be a really good thing to do for the state of Kansas. I also would work with our county election officials to follow the law. SB 130 was passed into law, signed by great Governor Kelly 3 years ago. And I have heard my opponents say recently, well, the Sedgwick County didn't want it. I will tell you, there are people in Sedgwick County and the county elections office who would push back on that very harshly. They've done everything they can to be able to vote anywhere. That's our Vote Anywhere law. And our current Secretary of State has stood in the way of that and buried it in rules and regulations. So that's something that I would work with the counties to implement so that voting is easier, and not work against them and blame them for why I, as the Secretary of State, haven't been able to help them implement that.
Scott Schwab.
Again, going back to disinformation, that's incorrect. We were moving forward with rules and regs, and the election clerk at the time was helping us write those rules and regs so that they were able to do it. When we finished the rules and regs, which would have come out quicker, but Commissioner Howell and Wichita and the DNC and the Kansas Democrat Party sued our office, which slowed down the process 8 months, but we were still able to get the rules and regs out, and any county can do it. We worked with Sedgwick so they could do it in 2021, but when they realized they couldn't come up with a backup plan, they didn't do it. Right now, it's legal. The Supreme Court said you can do it. It's up to any county who wants to do it. It's just incredibly expensive because if there's a network outage, it's not like early advance voting where if you can't vote today, you can come back tomorrow and vote on election day. You don't get to come back tomorrow and vote. You need to have ballot on demand. And to do that, that's incredibly expensive. But what we've done, whether it's my legislative years or coming into the Secretary of State's office, we have worked diligently to increase it because it's the Kansas way. Whether it was during the Civil War, we're trying to find ways to get soldiers to vote, and we were one of the first states to embrace early advance voting. We've worked through UACAVA, we've worked through the Help America Vote Act. We're one of the few states that have as long of an early voting process as we do. So, but to take a holiday for the election, poll workers and clerks would not get paid, would have to take a day off on a day that we need them the most. And we have hundreds and hundreds of poll workers. So to say, well, it's just going to be a holiday, when we have massive voter turnout, new records being busted in this state on voter turnout, I don't think a holiday is going to change the needle on that.
Well, apparently people are very interested in this debate. This is my pile of questions from the audience, social media. We won't get to them, but one of the questions I'm just going to use as a follow-up to this question we had, and the question is, 22 states, so you each get a minute, 22 states allow either election day or early voting called same-day registration. Should Kansas have that same-day registration? It's a follow-up, so we'll just start with Scott Schwab.
You know, the legislature's looked at it 3 times, and every time the Senate committee, both in a bipartisan way, have rejected it. And a lot of it's pretty difficult because it does allow one for a compromise in voter security simply because you don't know who's showing up. In our border counties like Johnson and Wyandotte, it wouldn't be difficult for somebody to vote on both sides of the state line. And the other situation is voter intimidation. You could have a union where they say, hey, have you voted? No, I just moved here. I don't even know who the candidates are. Well, you're going to go vote, and here's who you're going to vote for. And so by having that voter registration system, it has worked. Our system works great. Overwhelmingly through the elections, again, we have highest voter registration turnout. We have brand new primary number turnout. 2020 was the highest voter turnout in the history of the state for a presidential election. I don't see where you can come in and say, well, this state does it this way. Well, a lot of those states are looking to us saying, well, how do you do it? And I would say our county clerks, our poll workers are doing a fantastic job all the way from Wyandotte County down to Morris County.
JeAnna Repass, same-day registration?
I'm not in favor of it at this point, and I will tell you why. This is solely why, because we have way too many people right now who are disenfranchised by our voting process. And if we were to move away from what we're currently, we ought to fix what we're doing right now. And by fix, it's not that I'm saying we have fraud, but what we have is disenfranchisement. What we have is a level of distrust. And before we do something like bringing in same-day voter registration, we got to get back to the people of Kansas. And I have to tell you, I have to counter back to Mr. Schwab, where he said that pretty much there's nothing to see here. And yet, and still, Sedgwick County is not able to execute the vote anywhere law. So if it was as simple as Mr. Schwab is telling you, we'd have it done. So until we can even execute the laws that we have on the books, and I will do that as your Secretary of State, we shouldn't be looking to do something like same-day voter registration. I'm saying I wouldn't look at it in the future, but where we are right now, we've got to execute the laws that we have for voters on the books right now.
We're going to take a dramatic change because most people don't know that the Secretary of State's office has business-related functions. So we're actually going to ask a question about that. What do you see as the Secretary of State's role in assisting existing businesses and attracting new employers to Kansas? And we start with Scott Schwab.
Yeah, so we campaigned on this 4 years ago, and I always like to start with this story real quick that I was at lunch with former Secretary of State Jack Breyer and Ron Thornburg, and they told me that Kansas was the first state to use computers to show tabulated results on election night. Before if you remember, you would write it on a marker board or a chalkboard. And Ron Thornburg, who worked for Jack, had to run a cord out of the second floor, down the rotunda, in the basement, and up into the transportation department where they had the same computer system. The CEO of IBM was in the Capitol that day to make sure it works. Here's where the problem goes south. We are still on that computer system. It is like going from a Radio Shack Tandy TRS-A computer to an iPhone 14. And we didn't get there in 4 years, but we're going to be able to do it in 5. And the goal will be to have a business one-stop where you will be able to put in, if you're starting a restaurant, just fill out the wizard. Then you don't have to go to ag to get your permit. You don't have to go to liquor to get your liquor permit. You don't have to go to labor to get your unemployment insurance. You don't have to go to commerce to get a scholarship there. You can just click send. And we have created a working partnership with the administration and deputy secretaries within the governor's office to have this ongoing conversation to go there. We have phase 1 done. Phase 2 won't happen until we get off that computer system. Once we get off that AS400, we'll probably have to donate it to the State Historical Society.
JeAnna Repass.
I am absolutely shocked that Mr. Schwab took that stance. When he's been in the legislature for 20 years, he has had access to it for 4 years. I will tell you this, what this sounds like a lot to me is I bought my kids, I bought my son a VR headset that he just wanted really bad. And after he played for a little, he put it away. And then anytime anybody else comes by and wants it, no, that's mine, or I got this. You've had 4 years, Mr. Schwab, to get that taken care of. And now you're telling the people of Kansas that you just need one more. Obviously that, 12 months is the magic number, not 4 years. I would love to see the plan that we've been working on to get us off of that system that Jack Breyer told you about that was 20, 30 years old. On day one, I will come in and we will get this done. And I agree with Mr. Schwab, you will see results in a year, but not because someone else is challenging me for the job that I have been derelict in doing. You will have it because I'm going to come in on day one and tell you as small business owners that I care about the fact that you can't do your registries and that we don't have seamless integration. Mr. Schwab referenced earlier, he likes it when I quoted him. Well, we sat at a Kansas Chamber event, and I will tell you, I've heard Mr. Schwab list some pretty good language that I have been using about seamless integration on behalf of our small businesses. There's zero excuse that has taken this long for Mr. Schwab to decide that he's going to pay attention to something so fundamental to the Kansas economy. That will not happen when I am your Secretary of State.
Thank you. And this question comes from the audience, from you. And we're going to start with JeAnna Repass with it. Please state your position on the 2021 election bill that was passed by the Kansas legislature.
Can you cite which bill that is?
That was the bill that involved putting limits on the number of ballots that people could deliver to drop boxes, and also the ability to make it a criminal offense if somebody believes that somebody's representing themselves as an election official.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate the clarity because I've been talking to our state legislators, and I spoke specifically to Aletha Fauskado, who was a part of that elections committee out of the state Senate, and she fought really hard because that first rule was they were trying to limit it to 3 people, and then they pushed it to 5, and then she said, if I have a family, as she does, that has 10 siblings in it, we have to be able to help each other vote because we want to make sure everyone votes. What I will say is that is the law of Kansas, and I will execute the law, but I will also use the full force of this office in committee to ask them to reconsider what those limits should be. I will tell you, I've heard from people who live in group homes, our disabled communities, our elder communities, who have said that this is a strife for them. When you have more than 10 people living in a community who want to vote, and isn't that what we want? We want everyone to cast a ballot. Because you're assisting someone in casting that ballot doesn't mean that you're harvesting votes. It just means that someone has cast their vote and who may have difficulty getting to a polling place or getting to a drop box. So, however, that is the current law. As your Secretary of State, I will execute law. I will not get us involved in frivolous lawsuits that cost us millions of dollars and get overruled. What I will do is execute the law, but I will be working closely with the legislature to see how we can improve and relook at those laws. That's the great thing about a representative republic. We can always go and make changes.
Scott Schwab.
Yeah, so when I was in the legislature, Joan Wagner gave one of the best lines as it relates from someone who was a legislator to going into administration and on tax. And we were going through tax, the tax rebates and tax exemptions. And when asked certain questions, she says, that's a policy question, you're the policy maker. We do what you tell us to do. And I thought that was incredibly humble and brave for her to say. And while, granted, she's a Democrat and as a Republican, I often try to trip her up, she always caught me with that phrase saying, you're the policymaker, you make the policy. The legislature made that policy, and it was a compromise. They ended up going with the exact same number on ballot harvesting that Colorado has. And the question came up in committee from an advocate from trying to stop ballot harvesting, saying, should a person be allowed to turn in 10,000 ballots at one time? To which the gentleman said no. He said, okay, so we agree ballot harvesting should be banned. The question is, what's the number? And that's when it turns over to policy. The legislature decided on that number. As it relates to it being illegal to pose as a poll worker, I don't even understand how they pull that, what that is. You know, I'm not a poll worker. I'm the Secretary of State, but it's against the law to pose as a Secretary of State. If you've seen this, you don't want to pose as a Secretary of State for the state of Kansas. But at the end of the day, the legislature makes laws, and you can chime in, but the legislature is going to be the legislature. I don't care what Governor Kelly has seen the legislature pass bills she didn't like, but she signed them. That's the process.
All right, thank you. A number of questions about this topic. I'll do my best to consolidate, sum it up. Following the August Kansas primary, numerous counties, as we've been talked about, had to do citizen-requested recounts. There was some confusion with this process in terms of timing and paying for it. And actually, I've had people ask me, is the state going to end up having to pay for this? So would either of you care to comment on whether you'd recommend any changes to the recount law and how that process went? And we start with Scott Schwab, according to my notes.
Yes, we would recommend, and we have recommended, and the legislature never saw it as a priority. So, although I think they will this year after what we've gone through. And I want to correct something that was said before. The state is not on the hook for that. That credit card cleared. That is by law that we have to have that bonded cash in the check account before we can tell clerks to go count. And we are now cutting those checks. We had to make sure we had everybody's invoices in, and they were invoicing us only for what the statute said they could be invoiced for. So, for example, some counties were invoicing, they bought poll workers lunch. The statute says we can't pay for that. We only pay for their labor and the cost of the employees to do that, and we want to make sure we're within the guidelines of the law. The law is incredibly vague, but we always lean on pro-voter. The constitutional amendment was not a person. It wasn't a candidate. It was an amendment, and our Constitution belongs to everybody. So when asked, should we allow this recount to go forward based by any citizen, well, if the law's unclear, err on the side of the voter. Let them do what they want to do, and as long as it's within what we can defend in court. We did talk to the Attorney General. He agreed that he thought it would be within the law. We wouldn't get sued for it, nor did we. So the recount happened. It was very redeeming. It showed our county clerks do good work. As frustrating as it was, the argument, the rhetoric, the frustration, at the end of the day, our phones quit ringing.
JeAnna Repass?
Well, here's what I would say. I never said that the people were on the hook. I said they could have been. And when you're doing something on a credit card, that's a big risk when you're required to have cash bonds. I'm glad it cleared. Thank goodness that's what happened. So, you know, it was a big risk to take, and it was a gamble, and it paid off. As far as the question about automatic recounts, I was studying statute today. I'm making sure that I am up to speed on what the people of Kansas are going to require of this office, and we don't have a statute that triggers an automatic recount. I could beat Mr. Schwab by 100 votes, and there would be no automatic trigger for a recount. But that would be something that has to be initiated by the state legislature. Right now, we don't have that. As Mr. Schwab said, individuals, as long as they're willing to foot the bill, can ask for a recount pretty much at any point at whatever the margin of victory or loss is. I think that's a little problematic, but I will tell you, I'm not going to take credit cards for that. There's way too much value and importance on our elections to mess around with something like that, but I will tell you I would also work with the legislature, and let's talk about that. And I quite frankly will tell you the people of Kansas have been telling me that there's some ways to improve. As I said earlier, we can always get better, and here's one of those places. Again, it is a function of the legislature, but there has to be a symbiotic relationship between the Secretary's office and our state legislators. And I'm going to make sure that I'm welcome in the State House, and that I'm there often, and that I'm working with our legislators to make sure that we are doing things that move us forward in the state, including looking at how we do recounts.
Thank you. Gerrymandering is manipulating the boundaries of an electoral constituency so as to favor one candidate or one party over another. Would you support an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission to draw district lines in Kansas? And we start with JeAnna Repass.
Listen, I will always support ways that we can do things better. And we just had a redistricting as according to law. Our Kansas Supreme Court upheld it. I will follow the law. I understand the Supreme Court looked at it and said this was fair and this is what will serve the people of Kansas better. I will tell you, I have to raise a little eyebrow when I see that the Big First now includes Lawrence and carves Lawrence out of Douglas County, and that Wyandotte County has now been split into 2 congressional districts, literally right along I-70, neighbors who are now in different congressional districts. But I do think it's always important to have commissions to look at things. And if that's something that helps with transparency, that helps voters feel like this isn't some kind of a partisan move so that certain parties stay in power, I would absolutely be in support of that. Again, that's a function of the legislator. If you, as the Secretary of State, are working with those legislators, you can have some influence there, but most certainly they ought to be listening to their constituents. Now, I will say this is a great opportunity to tell the people of Kansas that you must get engaged in your process. You elect your legislators. If there's something that they're doing that does not reflect your will or the will of the people, call them. Or better yet, get involved in the process. Run for office. Don't sit back and think that things are happening to you. This democracy belongs to you. Get involved. If you don't like the new redistricting, I would encourage you to run for office.
Scott Schwab?
Well, a lot of folks ask me, said, why are you supporting this redistricting, which I don't have a vote. All we do is take the census numbers, and we are the official receiving office from Washington, D.C., and hand it to the legislature. And it is a separation of powers issue. The administration should not be telling the Secretary of State's office what districts should look like. That is a decision by the legislature. I have always looked at states that did have an independent council looking at redistricting to draw lines. And what I found out is they're not independent. They're all appointed by partisans. The legislature, what they do is they do statewide meetings, they go through communities, and it was difficult during a pandemic year. And I will also say it was disappointing with the pandemic year and the shutdowns because our census numbers, I think, were flattened because of it. We were working diligently with the administration to try to make sure we were getting every voice counted for that census so we had more accurate numbers. But then things got shut down and we couldn't go door to door to get those numbers like we wanted. But really, you were either going to split Wyandotte or you're going to split Johnson County. It was unconstitutional to put those two because the populations were just too great. The question is which ones got split. You can either split I-35 or you do I-70. The legislature chose I-70 and the court said it was within reason. I talked to somebody from Lawrence who said, I just can't believe I'm in the 1st district. I said, well, you are for your U.S. Senate seat. We're all Kansans. The numbers break down so that we all have one person, one vote.
I have an audience question. It's about improving voter turnout, and I am old enough to remember that MTV used to bring on Madonna and tell people to vote. So all sorts of things have been tried. So the question is, what can the Secretary of State do to improve voter turnout? And I'll twist that a little bit to say, what would you do to improve turnout? As we've talked about, things can always be a little bit better, and we start here with Scott Schwab.
When I first got elected in 2018, we went to what was called, I call Secretary of State kindergarten. All us new Secretary of State, both Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, went to San Diego to have a conversation of what to expect as a Secretary of State. Here's the conversations, here's the legality, here's what the U.S. Constitution says. And one of the things they said, and it was really fascinating to me, bipartisan, those who had been around, it is not the Secretary of State job to drive up the vote. You are the referee on the basketball court. It is not your job to drive up the score. It is your job to make sure those who are qualified to participate can, and the laws and the rules are followed. But it is not your job to drive up the score, because then it's like Kobach and his PAC. That money went to candidates to put mailers out to drive up vote for one candidate, one side. And that's what the perception is. It is our job to push voter registration. And I want to let this folks know just real quick. If you are going to be 18 on Election Day, we're already past the voter registration deadline, but we always tell folks, go ahead and register to vote while you're 17 if you're going to be 18 on Election Day. And if you got kids or grandkids next year that are going to be seniors and they got a chance to vote in local elections for school boards, which affect them, very much so. Please make sure you know when you're 17, but election days you're going to be 18, please register to vote. And that is one thing our office puts in a lot of time, is driving out that voter registration and we've even done voter registration drives with the league down in Wichita.
JeAnna Repass.
I'm going to give you a straightforward answer. Trust and conversation. That's how you improve voter turnout. People have to trust that when they go to the polls, their vote counts. I will tell you, being a Democrat in Kansas, a largely red state, I've heard lots of Democrats say, my vote doesn't count, my vote doesn't matter, why should I vote? That's where the conversation comes in, because I say to them, absolutely. There's a school of thought that says, hey, if your party's not winning, get used to losing less bad. That's called improvement. And I would challenge everyone, your vote is your voice. Tu voto es tu voz. La democracia requiere todas las voces. Our democracy requires all of our voices. If we can reinstill trust in our voting process, that's going to improve voter turnout. And how do you get to that place of trust? You have conversations. You don't sit in Topeka and hide from the voters. Voter registration is extremely important. That correlates to voters. You have to register in order to vote. But once you've registered, if people have lost confidence, faith, and trust in our system, we're going to continue to have lower turnout. And that is absolutely unacceptable in our great democracy. What level of voter turnout is going to be acceptable? Are we going to get down to 10%? We have got to, I would love to see Kansas have the highest voter turnout in the country. That's going to start with trust and conversation. As your Secretary of State, I am here to listen. I am here to talk to you. I'm here to help reinstill trust in this great democracy. And I want Kansas to have the highest voter turnout in the entire country. We are the free state, and we can lead the country on this.
Time has flown, and amazingly, it's the last question, and it's flown so fast you actually only get 20 seconds for it, because it's a quick question. It is, you've been elected Secretary of State. Congratulations. You walk in the office. What's the first thing you do? And we start with JeAnna Repass.
First thing I do is SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to the office, to voter security, and to the state of Kansas. That's what I'm going to do. The next thing I'm going to do is put together a nonpartisan advisory panel, both on businesses and elections. And that's going to include all the voices of the people of Kansas. And we are going to get to work day one on that website. So there's 3 things. I hope that was 20 seconds.
Very good. Scott Schwab.
Well, we've been listening, but we've been doing for 4 years, and we're going to continue to do. The lower turnout, what was just mentioned, we've had the highest turnout in history under our administration. That's what we're going to continue to do, is to move that needle up by continuing to register voters. You get more voter turnout if you have more people registered.
You both did it, 20 seconds, fabulous job. Now it's time for our candidates to make their final case to the voters. They have 150 seconds to do so. We start with Scott Schwab.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Bob. Thank you, the university, my opponent, and thank you for the league and the university. And hopefully we've shown that, although we've been accused of not listening, but we do, and folks that aren't turning out to vote. But again, the numbers don't lie. We've had the highest voter turnout in a primary in 2020. We had the highest voter turnout in state history for a presidential election, and it was easy to vote. We didn't have lines in that presidential election despite a pandemic going on. And through our recounts and our post-election audits, we discovered no broad cheating or attempts to cheat. On our Business One Stop, it's not a legislative mandate to get that up in 4 years. We want to make sure, like I said before, we get the right answer, not the wrong answer. When you are migrating off what's essentially a TRS-80 computer to an iPhone 14, that didn't happen in 4 years. But we're going to do it in 5. That's pretty impressive. And we're doing it in-house without raising business fees, asking the state for tax dollars, or compromising it by going out through a third party. I'm proud of that. And that's an enhancement to the office. Whereas there's a statutory deadline for an ethics filing report to have been done by midnight tonight, and she's the only one statewide candidate who hasn't filed it yet. If we're going to criticize on deadlines, let's do the ones that the law says you got to do. And we've been compliant with that. And I know ethics, their website is wonky. It's a pain in the rear. We've worked hard with them. But we all have been able to do it. As frustrating as that website, which is different than the one she's criticizing us on, is. Our website, as it relates to business filings today, is fantastic. The legal community has complimented us on it. The financial institutions community has, the Chamber of Commerce has, let alone the countless business owners we've talked to about what they would like to see in the enhancement. We are making this office better, and in return making the state better. And we're doing it without shouting. We're doing that without stomping or spiking the football. We just want to be the secretary for the state of Kansas. Let's not make it any more sexy than it is. You are a filing office. We do not regulate. We do not create policy. We don't even, all we do is we file. That's what we do, and we set standards. And we do it very well. Even Governor Kelly and Derek Schmidt both have said we do a fantastic job. When you get those two to agree, at least they're agreeing on something.
All right, thank you. JeAnna Repass, 2.5 minutes.
Well, I am going to have to address the swipe about my compliance. I am not a politician. I'm a first-time candidate. I have an exceptional compliance officer, and those compliance rules are arduous, and we are trying to make sure that every single penny that we have raised is accounted for. My compliance officer is working within the confines, including some extensions, so everything I have done is ethical. My filings are ethical, and they will be done. I'm not a career politician. I haven't been in Topeka for 20 years. And we'll make sure that we are in compliance with the law. And let me be very clear, I don't think Scott Schwab deserves another year to do something that I will do in the first year. Magically, it's going to take 1 year, even though he's had 4 to fix something. But we're going to move on from that. I would really like to thank the moderator, Bob, and the hosts of tonight's forum. My hope is that voters have become informed as they consider their vote on who should be the next Kansas Secretary of State. And I will make you this. You have 2 choices. Please consider 2 things. First, who will better represent you and work, not simply be a secretary, but actually work to ensure that the voices of all voters in Kansas will be counted and heard. We need safe and secure elections for every voter, but that does not require an outcome that leads voters to disenfranchisement or voters feeling that they've been cut out of our system. Secondly, politicians will always, give me 1 more year, give me 1 more term you. They will do that to voters every election. If you want a career politician who will continue a history of rubber stamping behavior, rubber stamping Chris Kobach's disastrous election policies that led to years of lawsuits and millions of dollars in fines and legal costs, you have a candidate to vote for. But if you're ready for fresh ideas and a candidate ready to reach out to county clerks, election officials, and voters to ensure all voices are heard, I humbly ask for your votes. On day 1 as your Secretary of State, I'll be working every day for the voters of Kansas. Not partisan ideology or purpose. We must have safe elections where every vote matters. We are a country that needs everyone, that works for inclusion for voters without any kind of voter suppression. Every voter in Kansas must feel that Kansas election process is transparent. I will tell you, I'm the daughter of a Vietnam veteran and a civil rights activist. My father was a career law enforcement officer. My mom was a pastor. My father's a lifetime Republican. My mom a lifetime Democrat. And what they taught me was that we can have disagreement. And where there's disagreement, we can have dialogue. And where we have agreement, we can make progress. As your Secretary of State, we will have disagreements, but we will have dialogue. And we will make progress. I want to thank you for the time. I'm asking you to hire me. And I humbly ask for your vote on November 8th to be your Secretary of State. You can go to JeAnnaRepass.com to learn more about me. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. You've been watching and listening to the 2 candidates for Secretary of State for the state of Kansas. Our thanks to Democratic Party candidate JeAnna Repass and Republican Scott Schwab. On behalf of our debate partners, the League of Women Voters, and from all the wonderful production crew and volunteers here at the studios of KTWU in Topeka, I'm Bob Beatty, and thanks for watching and listening. Go ahead and vote if you haven't already. Goodbye.